The United States' NATO and European allies were left out of the loop on its impending attacks on Iran. But nearly a week into the war, they're increasingly getting involved, with several European countries sending military assets to Greek-administered Cyprus, where an Iranian drone hit a British base earlier this week. Britain and France have also both deployed fighter jets to Gulf countries, and France's Charles de Gaulle aircraft carrier is headed to the Mediterranean, where it's due to arrive this weekend. For some analysis, we can bring in James J. Townsend Jr., a senior advisor at the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, Transatlantic Security Initiative. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Now, EU countries say they are in a purely defensive position. France's army minister was on television last night insisting France is not at war. Would you agree with that, or would you consider them a part of this war at this point?
Well, I think the pilots in the cockpits and the sailors on those ships, they might feel they're at war. It's very up close and personal, of course, for them. But in terms of the intent of the countries that are now rather reluctantly having to go in and protect nationals who are there, French tourists or business people that might be somewhere in the Middle East. This is not something that they set out to want to do, to take part in what the Israelis and the Americans are doing, but it's something they feel they need to do to show that they're able to protect their own people and their interests.
And why are they doing that? I mean, are European countries acting at this point sort of more out of a duty to their own citizens and to their Gulf allies than to the U.S.?
I think that's right. And it's different from in the past, where a lot of times when allies would support U.S. operations in the Middle East, a lot of it was out of loyalty, if you will, or supporting the United States. And they were brought along in a process before the U.S. took action, where allies are able to express their support because the Americans have explained it, and they've gone for maybe some authorization from the UN or something along those lines. But this time around, I think it's not so much out of loyalty as it is that because the war has spread throughout the Middle East, there are a lot of national interests there. There's European interests there. And most importantly, there's people from Europe stranded there that need help and want to feel that they are being protected, as well as the regional countries who do have relationships with the UK or France, who are looking to both of those countries to provide support to them as well, to knock out these missiles or drone attacks so that their hotels and their airports aren't being bombed. So there's an expectation there as well for France and UK allies to be protected.
Spain's socialist prime minister, Pedro Sanchez, has taken the strongest position of any European country against the war, refusing to let the U.S. use Spanish bases. Can you talk about the case of Spain and what's motivating that opposition?
Well, I think certainly there's the view of the Spanish leadership that this is a war that they don't want to have their fingerprints on, and I don't think you can discard that their own views of this war, its legality, and whether this is something good for the Spanish people to be involved in. But I'm certain there's also politics in Madrid, and there's also the view that Europe may have of Spain or Spanish interests that are not as at risk as other nations might be. That certainly has a role to play in this as well. So I'm sure it's complicated, but it's one that has certainly gotten the attention of President Trump.
And as you're saying, European countries don't really want to be involved in the conflict at this point. They feel sort of like that they have to protect their citizens. Is there anything, though, that could make them enter the war in a more active way? And what might that be?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I don't see them becoming more involved. In other words, joining up with the United States and Israel and bombing Tehran. I think they are in a defensive mindset. They don't necessarily have the capabilities to take part in a broader war like this. I think they've got their hands full just taking care of their national interests, whether it's Cyprus or some of the Gulf nations, as well as getting their people out. I think that is something where over and above that kind of defensive posture, I think that's not going to be really expected. In terms of Israel or the U.S., I don't think we're looking for that kind of support.
Is there a danger, though, that, once you have European aircraft up in the air, you have European ships around, I mean, is there a danger that they could get struck and sort of dragged further into it?
Well, you're right about that. They certainly are in harm's way, and can be hit or can incur casualties. That could certainly happen, but I don't think necessarily that will spring them into the war in an offensive way. I think this is still something where the European nations are in a defensive crouch, and are doing their best to try to, not just protect their own interests and their own people, but try to find a way out, to get a de-escalation going, to get some type of diplomacy going, to find an off-ramp, as they say. I don't think the European nations at all like what is happening. I think they want to see much more of a de-escalation. They're not in the driver's seat. They know that. So there is that kind of work, I'm sure, going on behind the scenes.
And just very, very briefly, because we are running out of time, does the EU have any leverage to create that de-escalation? They have leverage, because I think the U.S. is finding that this war is not quite turning out the way they thought it was, in terms of what's happening in the Gulf, how long this might take to happen, the impacts on the energy situation in terms of gasoline prices at home. There's a lot of consequences that come from a war like this, particularly in the Middle East. So I think right now there's some leverage, in a sense that if European nations can come to Washington and say, look, how about this as a way out? There's something that they might be able to do in the diplomatic area to take some of the pressure off. That I think right now the U.S. is realizing it needs friends, it needs allies, and maybe it needs a helping hand to try to de-escalate things. All right, James J. Townsend Jr., thank you again so much for your analysis this morning. We'll have to leave it there. That was James J. Townsend Jr. of the Atlantic Council giving us his analysis. We'll have to take a short break. Stay with us if you can on France 24. More news coming up in just a moment.